changes, 70s to 90s, part 2. We're also going to see a continuation of the women's movement. The thing is, the women's movement back in the 60s is then going to help bring about legislation in the 70s. So it's going to be things like Title IX, which if you're going, hey, that sounds familiar, that's because you probably read about Title IX on your syllabus for this class. It's a big deal. So Title IX was an amendment to it was an educational amendment made in 1972 to the Civil Rights Act. And basically it prohibited discrimination by sex in any educational program receiving federal aid. We have expanded Title IX a lot more. Title IX, as you see in your syllabus, talks about like sexual misconduct and everything there. Initially, what a lot of it was looking at was equality between the genders in a lot of athletic programs, actually, in higher education or even lower or even like high school education and such. So it really did expand athletic opportunity and equalize this balance of like men and women in like faculty positions, for instance. Also, in 1972, we get a big push for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. Now, the ERA actually said that equal rights under the law shall not be denied based upon account of sex. The thing is, to pass, this needed 38 states to ratify it. However, you are going to see conservatives basically who wanted to preserve like traditional family patterns, including a lot of women specifically who wanted like respect as housewives and not to be ever drafted, caused the ERA to be actually 3 states short. So the ERA does not go into effect, although recently in 2019 it's been brought back up, so we will see, keep watching the ERA to see if it goes anywhere at this point. This brings us to another really important case during this time period that people to this day have very, very strong feelings about. Abortion rights. So basically in January of 1973, we get the Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade. Now, in this case, the court is going to strike down state laws that forbid abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Now, unfortunately, there's a double negative there. So basically, it's saying that it will allow abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. The other thing it did is it set guidelines for abortion during the remaining months. When people talk about someone getting an abortion really, really late in a pregnancy, basically that comes down to issues of like the mother is going to die if the child is carried to full term and everything. So that's what Roe v. Wade did, is that it just set those kinds of guidelines of what kind of situation it had to be to warrant an abortion later than 3 months. This Supreme Court case actually drew from a previous Supreme Court case of Griswold v. Connecticut, which specifically dealt with birth control. And basically in that, it said that the 14th Amendment included the right to privacy, and thus that blocks states from interfering in a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. So we're seeing it's a right to privacy is the idea. But this Supreme Court case really does push the two political parties in opposite directions. We do see behind a lot of the rhetoric used, especially at the time when it was passed, there was a lot of fears from men of increased job competition during a time of economic crisis, because the thing is, when women can control when they get pregnant, that means they can compete more economically for jobs against men. There was also just a concern about like changing families and the setup with a lot of times women, stay home after having a baby, partly for reasons like they were the ones that had the baby and they're having to recover from having a baby. If you've ever had a baby, you have to go through a recovery period afterwards. And then with if you're choosing to do breastfeeding and stuff like that, obviously the man cannot necessarily do that. There was also this very much view of women as anchors of families. And so the idea of giving them full equal rights as individuals, it's a bit conflicting in its views and everything like that. But we can see that wherever you may land on this case, these arguments tap into really deep and emotional issues. I mean, you have the right to life versus the right to privacy and freedom of choice and such. And so this is still a highly debated topic to this day. We're also going to see, I should mention, during this time period, more and more women in the workforce. A lot of this is because of the fall in wages for many men forced women to go back to work. But you also see an increase in so-called women's jobs. This is anything from data entry to reservation agents or even nurses. You can still see this a little bit today in that there's certain occupations that a lot of people automatically view as, oh, that must be a woman and that must be a man. A great example of this is my best friend is a dentist, and she laughed. She cannot say how often when she was in dental school, people would go, oh, so you must be training to become a dental hygienist. And she's like, no, I'm going to be a dentist. So these kinds of things go on through to today. The United States economy really is going to divide jobs by categories of sex, more so than segregate them by race when we're looking at the 90s America. We also are going to see AIDS and HIV during the 80s. Basically, scientists are going to identify a new disease pattern known as AIDS, or the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. These symptoms are going to result from an infection by HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus. Basically, it destroys a body's ability to resist disease. It's specifically transferred through blood and semen, and so during the 80s, some of the most frequent American victims were gay men and intravenous drug users. There isn't a lot done in the 80s to help individuals who had AIDS, partly because of discrimination against the LGBTQ community during that time period, and gay men specifically. But a decade later, we are going to see that it's clear that AIDS was not just a gay man's disease, that it was a national issue. It was a global problem. We're seeing AIDS spread throughout America. By the time we get to the 90s, we are going to start getting more open discussions about gay sexuality and everything. But a lot of people are not always accepting of its reality. I mean, even when you look at the issue of gay people in the military, we're going to see Congress and Pentagon were cautious about accepting any kind of policy, and basically engaging in some sort of homosexual act became grounds for discharge. And so that's where you start getting don't ask, don't tell, so to speak, being part of the policy. We're also going to see a boom in religion in America during this time period. A lot of people were looking for a sense of community, and what better way to do this by establishing joining an established congregation or organizing a whole new institutional church and everything. Generally, when we look at Americans and religion, Americans generally take this kind of spiritual grounding more seriously than a lot of citizens of other industrialized nations in Europe. I lived in England for a full year. I cannot remember a single time I ever heard a single British person ever talk about their religion openly and publicly. They tend to try to keep it to themselves more so, except for if I was in a class and we were talking about religion in the past and everything like that. That's different. Religious belief also in America especially is a really important source of political convictions and a lot of basis for a lot of political actions taken. So we see that religious belief ties into people's politics. And it can be politics on like foreign policy to the role of women or the role of gay and lesbian members in a congregation. We are seeing an increase in the nation's religious diversity during this time period, but you also are going to see it confirmed that basically the dominant religion in America was Christianity. There is no official religion in America, but the most dominant one is Christianity. We're also going to see cultural wars because of a lot of these other things and changes that have been occurring during this time period. So if you go back to like the 50s and the 60s, a lot of Americans argued over like foreign policy and racial justice, and the economy. But the 70s and the 90s, through the 90s and even today, there's an element of a lot of people quarrel more about beliefs and values. We're also seeing things like patterns of family life become a lot more varied during this time period. Religious belief heavily influences politics, because basically people want to shape American politics to resemble their beliefs and their cultural backgrounds on the rest of the nation, so to speak. Typically, and this is, I say, a generalization, so I know there are exceptions to this rule. Typically, Americans who are undogmatic in their religions also tend to be more liberal in politics as well. And religious and political conservatism tend to go together. We are going to see conservatives try to initiate some of these cultural wars, basically trying to stabilize what they saw as America basically spinning out of control due to several issues like lack of self-discipline and all of this sexual indulgence. The evidence of some sort of sexual revolution is actually pretty mixed. The thing is, if you look at the 70s, yes, there are definitely growing numbers of like teenagers being sexually active during the 70s, but actually these numbers taper off in the 80s. In fact, you see like divorce rates actually start to drop after about 1980, and teenage pregnancies and births are also going to drop after about 1990. And the number of like two-parent families increase. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So looking at all of these changes and everything, how would you describe America at home during this time period?